would say that guns kill people. Some would say that people kill people. And still others say that giant robots from space kill people. Hi, my name is Kyrie and welcome to Flights of Fantasy, the show where we look at different science fiction and fantasy movies and ask, what do they mean? And today we're going to be looking at one of my personal favorites, The Iron Giant. If you happen to be in the market for a feel-good, autumny, wintry movie, this one might be the one for you. Made in 1999 and set in the middle of the Cold War, director Brad Bird spins a surprisingly heartfelt and profound tale for a kids' movie. Although The Iron Giant is a Warner Brothers animation production, it's frequently misremembered as a Disney movie, in large part because of the former and future Disney people that were involved in the production of this. And of course, because the mouse owns everything. It's a story about a boy and his alien robot friend. But it's also a story about fear, war, paranoia, existentialism. Who are we? What does it mean to be good? And it's also about grief. So if you don't remember this one, or maybe you just never saw it, or maybe you just need a little refresher, this is how it goes. We start in space, when suddenly a giant fiery thing shoots across the sky and hurtles towards Earth. We jump to the surface of the Earth on a boat that's just outside of Maine. It's being hurtled around by this massive storm, and it's a relief when they finally see the lighthouse. Except it's not a lighthouse. The ship crashes into this giant figure, and it's only through luck that the captain survives. In the light of day, we see our protagonist, Hogarth Hughes, riding his bike through the idyllic town of Rockwell, Maine. As a note, no, Rockwell is not a real place in Maine. It was inspired by the wholesome and nostalgic American works of Norman Rockwell. Hogarth goes to the diner where his mother works. We get the impression that the Hughes family is tight on money at the moment, and that Hogarth is always bringing around pets. Today he's brought in a squirrel, and of course shenanigans ensue. The squirrel escapes, and Hogarth tries to get help from this sleepy beatnik. This is interrupted when the boat captain from the opening scene is trying to tell people about this giant figure that he saw in the sea. He says that it came from space, and that he contacted Washington about it, and that it's probably either the Russians or invaders from Mars. Nobody believes him, of course, and they all call him crazy, but the beatnik stands up for him and says that he saw the UFO too. Hogarth talks to the beatnik, Dean, about what he saw, and Dean admits that he didn't see anything. But if we don't stick up for the kooks, who will? Of course, Hogarth's mom comes to check on him. The squirrel crawls up Dean's pants. Mayhem, mayhem, mayhem. Hogarth is in trouble. That night, Hogarth's mom has to work late, and like any good, responsible kid does, he feasts on junk food and desserts and watches scary movies that his mom would not approve of. Just when the movie's getting to the best part, though, the antenna goes out. Hogarth goes up to the roof to fix it, but the antenna itself is just completely gone, and there's a path of destruction and wreckage leading into the woods. With a suspicion of invaders from Mars in his mind, Hogarth suits up with BB gun and flashlight and heads into the woods to see what's up. The wreckage continues into the woods, where clearly something giant and strong has come. All is quiet when suddenly a massive metal man stomps up to the power plant and starts eating pieces of metal. He goes in for more and gets a massive shock. He steps back but gets tangled into all of these different electrical wires. Meanwhile, Hogarth's mom has come home and realizes that her son is absent, so she goes off looking for him. Hogarth, on the other hand, has gotten over the shock of the giant man and just wants to help him. Conveniently, there's a giant on-off switch on the side of the power plant, which is completely unguarded, so Hogarth pulls that. The electricity cuts out and the giant collapses. And then suddenly the giant man wakes up, gets to his feet, and starts following Hogarth, who is desperately running away. He runs away straight into his mother, who then scolds him and takes him home and presumes that he has eaten way too much junk food with all this talk about giant metal men. The next day, Hogarth is preoccupied with the thoughts of what exactly he just saw, and rumors are spreading all around the town. Metal objects have been having these giant bites taken out of them, although nobody seems to have connected that to the recent sightings of a Russian spacecraft nearby. All this is crowned off by the arrival of Kent Mansley, government agent. He's here to investigate what exactly happened to the power station, and the workers there suspect it was a giant beast of some sort. Kent Mansley doesn't really believe anything's happening until he goes back to his car and half of it is missing. Now he suspects that there is something big going on here. Meanwhile, Hogarth has decided he's going to try to lure the giant out with pieces of metal so he can have photographic evidence of the giant. He waits and waits and waits. Then he falls asleep. Then, when he wakes up, the giant is standing over top of him. Hogarth runs away, the giant follows him, Hogarth falls down, the giant catches up and sits down next to him. He's peaceful. It's clear that he's not going to hurt Hogarth, and in fact, he understands and remembers that Hogarth is the one who helped him out the other night. Hogarth tries to question the giant, ask where he came from, why he came, but the giant doesn't remember. Hogarth initially thinks that this could be a great scientific discovery that could be really cool, but he quickly understands that that could go very bad very quickly if someone were to start shooting. So the giant is going to have to stay secret for now. Hogarth tries to go home, but the giant isn't quite understanding him when Hogarth tells him to stay in the woods. I go, you stay, no following. As Hogarth is leaving, the giant takes a big bite out of the train tracks, and a train is coming. Hogarth panics, and together they rush to get the rails to get back together. So he doesn't quite connect it in time before he is hit by a train. The train itself is fine, but the giant, not so much. Initially, Hogarth is dismayed, but the giant sits up and there's an antenna that pops out of his head. It sends out a signal, and all of these strewn body parts of the giant are drawn and coming back to him. Hogarth hides the self-mending giant in the barn, right in time for Hogarth's mom to come home. Elsewhere, Kent Mansley is briefing the local authorities on the situation when the police station gets a call about the train accident. Kent Mansley rushes over there, where the conductor talks about a giant metal man that got in the way. Mansley needs a phone to call back to his superiors, but the closest phone is at the Hughes house. Parts of the giant are still making their way back to him, and Hogarth has to hide these parts from his mom. Just as he's about to get a dog-sized robot hand out of the door, Kent Mansley arrives. Annie, Hogarth's mom, lets him in. Mansley calls his boss for help, but the general is extremely doubtful of Mansley and says that he needs proof to bring any kind of help or troops to Maine. So Mansley has his orders to get concrete proof that giant robot aliens walk among us. Piece of cake. He's about to leave the Hughes house when he realizes that the BB gun that he found in the wreckage of the power station has Hogarth's name on it. Hogarth manages to get the giant robot hand out of the house, and Mansley leaves. Hogarth goes to read the giant a bedtime story. One of the things that he brings is a Superman comic book because of the parallels between Superman and the giant. And he points out that Superman only uses his powers for good, unlike Atomo, the metal menace. Hogarth is very clear in his belief that the Iron Giant is a good guy and that he will use his powers to help people. And the giant seems to really connect with that. The giant's stomach growls. The anatomy of metal-eating giant robots is kind of vague. And Hogarth and the giant go off into the woods to find him some food. Hogarth and the giant follow a tow truck to a local scrapyard with all of the metal that an alien robot could want. The giant has a feast, but he eventually sets off a car alarm, which wakes up the owner of the scrapyard. It's Dean, the beatnik from that diner. I fully believe that Dean would look like this if he were a woman in 2021, so it turns out that Dean turns a lot of the scrap in the yard into art, although he doesn't have very much luck with selling any of it. The giant hides and Dean invites Hogarth into his house. Together they drink coffee and Hogarth vents about not being able to fit in at school. Dean offers him some sage advice. You are who you choose to be. Suddenly there's a noise outside. Dean exits and sees the giant looming over the scrapyard. He grabs Hogarth and tells him to run, but apparently the giant doesn't really like Hogarth being grabbed like that and gives chase. The giant scoops Dean up and Hogarth has to intervene and say, "We like Dean." The giant sets Dean down and Dean gets an explanation about everything the audience already knows so far. Hogarth points out that the giant needs a place to stay and he needs food, and that doesn't go well. But eventually Dean's will is broken down and he agrees to let the giant stay for a night. Hogarth goes home and he doesn't even have enough time to get into bed before his mother tells him that they have a guest. Kent Mansley, who is now staying with them in their spare room and is definitely plotting something all day. Kent overhears and asks Hogarth questions, lots of questions. But before Hogarth can leave, his mom suggests, why don't you go and take him out to see the sights? At the same time, the giant is learning about the difference between trash and art. Dean is a classic misunderstood artist. Don't worry, man, one day you'll be a GIF. And that's kind of like art. Hogarth takes Kent to a diner and slips chocolate laxatives into his milkshake, which was a scene that made a lot of children afraid of chocolate back in the day, or at least some children. Just as Kent is working himself up with some Red Scare propaganda, nature calls and Kent rushes off to the bathroom. This is the perfect opportunity for Hogarth to escape, proving that drugging adults is productive and fun. Hogarth escapes and makes it back to the junkyard, where the giant is now making art for Dean. Hogarth argues that this is not dignified at all and decides they can be doing much more productive things, like playing spaceship or destroying a lake. We get a montage of Agent Mansley searching for evidence and going to the bathroom, when eventually he finds the camera that Hogarth lost on the night that he met the giant. He has the photos developed, and one of them has a picture of Hogarth with the giant in the background. That evening, Hogarth and the giant are in the woods when they run into a deer. It's a beautiful scene where the giant connects with nature and then grieves as it's shot by hunters. The giant scares the hunters away, and Hogarth has to explain the concept of a gun and what death is. As the giant looks at the gun, something seems to change in him. It only lasts for a second, but the giant's eyes are red and he seems to lose focus. Hogarth snaps him out of it and explains that guns kill people. That night, the giant can't sleep. He's seemingly still upset and feeling guilty about what happened to the deer. Hogarth tells him that it's not his fault and says that it's bad to kill, but it's not bad to die. The giant asks if Hogarth will die one day, and Hogarth explains yes. The giant asks if he will die one day, and Hogarth isn't sure. The giant is made of metal, but he has emotions, thoughts, feelings. According to Hogarth, that means that the giant has a soul, and souls don't die. The giant thinks about that, and he's maybe comforted. Hogarth goes back to the house, but he's trapped by Kent, who starts interrogating him. He has photos of the giant and can get the army in any day now, but he needs to know where the giant is. Hogarth keeps the secret until Kent starts threatening his mom. Hogarth crumbles and gives up the name of the junkyard and clearly feels terrible about it. But Kent tells him that it's all just a bad dream. And then he chloroforms a child. There's a lot of drugging in this movie. Hogarth wakes up just as Mansley is calling his boss, trying to get the army in to take care of the giant. And it works. Hogarth has to warn Dean, but he's trapped inside the house and Mansley is not letting him out. The result is a staring contest montage. Anyway, eventually Mansley falls asleep, but he's sure that he's won, until Hogarth reveals that he's been up for hours, and the army is here. Mansley heads to the scrapyard with Hogarth, Annie, the general, and the army in tow. He storms up to Dean and demands to know where the metal man is. Dean seems really forthcoming and tells him that the metal man is in the back. Dean leads the way and shows everyone a sculpture, or at least the giant disguised as one. But the general buys it and the army leaves, and Mansley is in big trouble. Annie buys it too, and she's pleased that Hogarth's talk about this giant metal robot have a reasonable explanation. Everybody leaves and the giant breathes a sigh of relief. And now it's back to playtime. But Hogarth and the giant have different ideas of what they want to play. Hogarth wants the giant to play a giant evil robot, and the giant wants to play Superman. Hogarth isn't bothered either way, and shoots his toy gun at the giant. The giant's eyes go red again, and he fires back a laser at Hogarth, which he doesn't see due to cinematic convenience. But Dean does see this. Then as Hogarth takes aim again, the giant loses control again, and Dean is there to the rescue. He tackles Hogarth to the ground, and a giant laser beam just narrowly misses them. Although the giant seems like he's back to normal after this, Dean isn't convinced. A bridge has been burned. Hogarth swears that it was an accident, but Dean says that he's just a weapon and that the army was right to come. The giant says he's not a gun, clearly doesn't want to be a gun. But the damage that he's done is pretty clear. The giant runs away as snow begins to fall. Hogarth runs after him, and Dean ends up helping too when he realizes that the giant's reaction was a defense mechanism. It was a response to the gun. Together, he and Hogarth drive off into the storm. The giant is walking through the wilderness, Superman sigil abandoned, when he hears a cry for help. Two kids who had been looking at the giant from a rooftop are dangling near death. People have gathered, looking up at these kids that are about to fall, unable to do anything. Just as the piece of wood that they're dangling from snaps, the giant slides in to save them. It looks like they fell the same distance that they would have anyway, except they landed on a giant metal hand instead of a snow-covered street. But okay, suspension of disbelief. The crowd sees everything, and they realize that the giant is friendly. But somebody else sees everything too. Kent Mansley. After a comic relief car accident, he gets the general to look back at the town, and this is bad. Hogarth and Dean arrive on the scene, and even Annie's there, as the giant says that I am not a gun, and he lifts Hogarth into the air on the palm of his hand. Just as this moment is at its most touching, a missile flies into the giant's back. The giant staggers into a building as soldiers pour in and continue to fire on him. The giant tries to shield Hogarth and runs off. Dean tries to intervene, explaining that the giant still has Hogarth, and that the giant only reacts defensively. Mansley says that he'll take care of it and proceeds to tell the general that the giant has killed a kid and they need to stop him now. The general calls for Code Red. The back of a nondescript American president is involved, jets fly off, everyone is after the giant. As a fighter jet flies by, the giant swerves to avoid a school bus and tumbles off a cliff, where he realizes that he has rockets in his feet and he can fly. The giant soars away, just like Superman, and for a minute he and Hogarth are able to forget about their troubles. But then the jets are back. They shoot the giant out of the sky. He crashes to the earth and is disoriented, but okay. But Hogarth? The same can't be said for Hogarth. We see the giant gently prod at Hogarth, the way he did with the body of the deer before. Hogarth doesn't move. The army forms a perimeter around the giant and begins to fire again, and the giant responds defensively. And this time, the giant doesn't hold back. The dent in his head pops out, his eyes go red, and he pulls out weapons we haven't seen before, missile launchers and plasma cannons. He easily decimates tanks. As the giant chases the army off, Annie and Dean catch up with Hogarth. He is unconscious, but okay. The giant is unrecognizable and unstoppable in this current state, and Mansley suggests that there's one thing they might be able to do to stop him. A bomb. He manages to convince the general that they can lure the giant away from the town and bomb it, and they proceed with this plan even though it's a terrible idea. Hogarth wakes up in the car and is intent on going back to the town and helping the giant. The army stops the car, trying to evacuate the area, and this is Hogarth's chance to escape. He runs up to the giant as it's targeting a battleship, and Hogarth manages to distract him long enough to ruin his aim. It narrowly misses the ship, and that is just about all the incentive the army needs to drop the bomb. Meanwhile, Hogarth is staring down the barrel of a missile launcher and armed only with words.
It's me! Hogarth, remember? It's bad to kill. Guns kill. And you don't have to be a gun.
And somehow, something connects. The giant returns to his normal state and seems confused at everything that's happened since his brain switch. Dean and Annie are trying to do just that with the general as Hogarth and the giant emerge from the smoke. And it works. The giant orders all units to stand down. But Mansley steals his radio and commands them to fire the bomb. And they do. There's essentially a nuke heading towards the robot's current position, and his current position is surrounded by a ton of people. And these people are going to die because there isn't enough time to run. Hogarth explains what's happening to the giant, and the giant makes a decision. Hogarth tells the giant that he loves him, and the giant flies up into the sky. The whole town watches as he goes to intercept the missile. We hear echoes of what Hogarth said earlier.
You are who you choose to be.
The giant chooses who he wants to be. Superman. Whew, this is the part in the movie where I always cry, without fail, every time. So even just talking about it makes me all emotional. The town's saved and everybody cheers. But it's a bittersweet moment for everyone who knew the giant, who knew how good he was. There's a time skip and we see a statue of the giant in the park of the town of Rockwell. He's a hero. But life goes on. Dean and Annie are together, and we find out that this statue is made by Dean. It's one of his latest creations. Hogarth is playing with other kids just like he wanted. He's also received a package from the general of the only piece of the giant that they recovered, a single screw. Later that night, or perhaps it's many nights later, Hogarth wakes up to find the screw tapping against his window pane, letting out a steady beeping sound. Hogarth opens the window and the screw rolls off. The camera follows and pans off into the distance, way into the distance, to Iceland. There we see all of the scattered parts of the giant slowly converging on something. The head of the giant letting out a homing signal. The giant's eyes open and the credits roll. Before the analysis, some background, and be warned that this section will have mentions of gun violence and suicide. The Iron Giant was directed and partially written by Brad Bird of The Incredibles and Ratatouille fame. This was actually his first full-length feature directorial debut. Tim McCandless was the other writer involved, but both he and Brad Bird drew heavy inspiration from the 1968 The Iron Man by Ted Hughes. Later publications of the book changed the name to The Iron Giant so as not to cause confusion with a billionaire playboy philanthropist that you may or may not know from a, kind of indie series about superheroes. Ted Hughes wrote the book to comfort his 2 children in the wake of his wife's death. One Sylvia Plath. In 1963, Plath committed suicide and left behind 2 young children. Hughes wrote what he called a modern fairy tale in response. The base elements of the story are the same. A young boy befriends a mysterious metal man, although it's set in England, and it doesn't feature a beatnik or any government agent characters. The giant doesn't crash land from space, he actually comes from the ocean. Also, but small detail, instead of fighting the army, he fights off a giant dragon from space. The journey from book to movie took an interesting path. First, in 1989, Pete Townsend from The Who created a concept album based off the book called The Iron Man, a musical. 2 years later, the story was pitched as an animated musical to Don Bluth, who eventually passed on it. Meanwhile, they put on a stage version of the musical in London, and after that, Warner Brothers bought the rights to the musical. Imagine giant metal Vin Diesel singing. It's been a long day. But ultimately it landed in the hands of Brad Bird and became the movie that we know today. Part of why Bird signed on might be because, like Ted Hughes, he had a personal stake in the story. At the time, he was grieving the loss of his sister, who had been shot and killed by her estranged husband. As Bird read the original novel, he saw the comfort that the author tried to create for his own children. The titular character gets hurt, but he can rebuild himself each time, the way a child might wish that their loved ones could do. This contrast of love and death was the crux of Brad Bird's pitch to Warner Brothers. Bird said, "What if a gun had a soul and didn't want to be a gun?" I really enjoy this movie. It's an obvious classic, and I think it's really good for both children and adults. Which is why I found it interesting that it was originally a huge flop at the box office and didn't find success until it was later released on VHS. Basically, Warner Brothers had just spent a lot of time, effort, and money marketing A Quest for Camelot, another animated movie that was an absolute bomb at the box office. So Warner Brothers was hesitant to give another animated movie their support. They dragged their feet, and in the end, the crew only had 4 months to market this movie. Nobody really knew that the movie existed, but the people who did see it loved it. It wasn't until the home video release that Warner Brothers put their full force into marketing the movie, and that did eventually pay off. Now it's remembered as a standout of Warner Brothers animation. But marketing aside, The Iron Giant wouldn't have succeeded if it wasn't fundamentally a good movie. Remember the guy that wrote the original story, Ted Hughes? And the director, Brad Bird? Both Bird and Hughes were seeking to turn this grief into comfort. They wanted to tell a story about loss and resilience in the face of that loss. That's a noble enough cause on its own, but both of these men specifically crafted these stories towards kids. There's something to be said about media that approaches children with serious topics and doesn't shy away. Yes, there's always room in the world for movies like Space Jam, but some adults seem to forget that kids understand and are willing, and sometimes want, to talk about the bigger things in life. Bird asks kids to think about what defines a weapon, what it means to be kind, and what it means to die. One aspect of the movie that I really like that's different from the book is Hogarth's dad. In the book, Hogarth's dad is very much alive and Hogarth talks to him, but in the movie, Hogarth's dad is never explicitly mentioned. We do see a picture of him where it's implied that he was in the Air Force or some other military unit, and it's further implied that he passed away because of that. So when Hogarth talks to the giant about how guns kill and what it means to die, he's speaking as somebody who has been on the other side of that grief and has moved past it. He's not just some conveniently wise for his age character that needs to espouse these plot points. It feels like the way a child would process this kind of thing. It really adds to Hogarth's character and contributes to the overall details of this movie that make it just so rich and satisfying and emotionally authentic. There's no shortage of the Iron Giant think pieces out there on the internet, but after a couple of really rough months for me, this was one that I found myself kind of drawn back to, and one that I wanted to appreciate with the eyes of an adult. And good news, it's still great. But what do you think? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Let me know in the comments below what movie you would like to see next, or if you had any thoughts about this video. A big thank you and special shout out to Mary, who wrote this episode. My name is Kyrie. This has been Flights of Fantasy, and until next time, live well and be kind.